This is a production of Cornell University Library.
Thanks for coming, and I just want to acknowledge Ken Mudge here in the audience as well, my co-author, back in the blue hat here, trickling in from from retirement. He retired from Cornell in January, so he's enjoying that experience, I believe. So I want to spend the afternoon here, spend the next hour, sharing a little bit about my process of how I came to co-authoring with Ken and sort of some of the stories and different things that we've learned in exploring this whole idea of forest farming and this idea of bringing agriculture and cultivation into the forest and finding mutual benefit there to the health of the forest and to production in some capacity, whether that's hobby or even commercial in some cases. So as was mentioned in the bio, I appreciate that. I kind of split my time between two hats. One's here at Cornell for the Small Farms program, do lots of different research and outreach efforts, edit the Small Farm Quarterly, which is a really nice paper if you're doing small farm work or interested. I'm really excited. I just published the first issue under my helm and had to put a mushroom on the cover of it. And actually that's lion's mane, which we'll talk about a little bit, because Ken wrote an article about lion's mane. And in addition to those things, co-teach a permaculture design course every fall in the horticulture department. And we balance that at home. I'm part-time at Cornell, I'm part-time at the farm, and so we're producing lots of different crops. We're not interested in vegetables, for instance, for commercial sales, but we produce a lot for our own use, so we're kind of mixing homestead and farm a little bit, figuring out which crops we like to grow at a commercial scale, and doing classes there as well. So part of my real passion is for sharing what I've been shared, all this knowledge that's built up over time, and really getting to put that out there, which is a big motivation for why Ken and I wrote the book. This was a handout, a ditto really, that I was given at a permaculture course I took back in 2002 during my college years, when I was becoming aware. I first started out doing outdoor, I don't even know what the major is anymore, like outdoor recreation. I just wanted to spend basically as much time as I could out in the woods. That was my goal. And so for a while I thought I'd be do leadership outdoors. I'd lead kayak trips and backpacking trips and do this kind of thing. But realized getting into some of the environmental issues that I couldn't just enjoy the outdoors. I really needed to have a connection in a way that was stewarding and taking care and restoring, because there just really wasn't that much virgin or untouched or fully healthy land out there. We have a legacy here to work with, especially when I look at forests. We have a lot of challenges. So this handout was given to me in my first permaculture course, and it's showing the area of virgin forest or primeval or original forest in the U.S. So 1620, so darker meaning more of that, right? And essentially disappearing down into nothingness today. Very, very few patches of what we call original forest. And there are patches around here in the Finger Lakes. They're in steep hillsides and really deep gorges and certain places that have had some stewardship from humans. For instance, Smith Woods. If you've ever been to the Trumansburg Fairgrounds or Grassroots, across the street is Smith Woods, which is this amazing, it's technically second growth forest, but it's an old forest, and that's one of the best examples around here of what these forests look like. But there's little patches, but by and large, these large tracts of forest are gone. And I was frankly confused when I first saw this depiction, because this wasn't what I saw in terms of forest. And so the difference really being that we have actually a lot of forest cover, and as we move up the East Coast, we go from 60% forest cover in Pennsylvania and New York all the way up to 90% in Maine, right? So I was a little confused at first about the juxtaposition of these two images, which one showed almost nothingness, and this shows, wow, there's actually quite a bit of forest cover. And what I've come to understand is that what we really are working with here are what I like to call teenage forests, all right? The Northeast in particular, the temperate forest there is incredibly resilient, and all it really took generally was for humans to walk off the land. So as people stopped farming and started working in cities, generally, the forests just came back, and we see that happening all over in various forms. But they're Teenage in the sense that they're a little awkward, they're a little limited. There might be some, some challenging issues to deal with. There might be some rites of passage, those kind of things. Some things that are a little sorted out. One example being that the forests that are coming back are often really narrow in their species diversity because they're getting their seed from whatever trees happen to be left over, right? The few trees that the farmer left in the hedgerow are seeding that new forest. And that's the forest, one of the patches we tend. We were just lucky that a few sugar maples were left in the hedgerow and they seeded this few acres of maples that we now get to enjoy. So we have a lot of mixture going on. We have a lot of challenge with diversity. Lots of other things going on here. Of course, exotic species, deer browse, things like that, changing, and we're not seeing the forest coming back looking like they used to, okay, is basically the end of the story here. And most of the forest, if you walk in a forest today, that forest is probably 1 generation old. There's very few forests that are in their 2nd or 3rd generation, really, okay? So a lot of the trees, even if they look different diameters, different sizes, have probably germinated that seed about the same time. So we're dealing with this kind of scenario, and this whole idea in the beginning of primeval or ancient or old growth forest is something we're very far from, and it might not be something that we're realistically going back to. We're moving towards something very different than that. So it's important, I think, to get some context for this before we get into the things that excite myself and Ken the most, like growing mushrooms and fruits and nuts. It's just to understand some of this bigger context. One of the assumptions about that early primeval forest was that it was largely untouched, right? When European settlers came, there was actually a fear mentality around the eastern forest. It was big and dark and scary and intimidating. And you see this in a lot of the literature at the time. And it was also assumed that the peoples that had lived there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, all the different Native American cultures, had basically been foraging, basically been finding food and consuming it on site and not doing much in terms of management. And that really couldn't be further from the truth. There was a lot of management going on, and the forest was actually much more of a mosaic of older, mature, late succession forests, mid-succession, and even open patches. And one of the main tools that natives would use, generally speaking, of course, based on geography and different culture, there's going to be lots of different customs, but fire was a very common tool that was used. And often in the eastern forest, it was used really in the beginning just to open up woodlands for hunting, just to make it easier to shoot that deer, through the trees. But there's all these unintended consequences that literally sprouted from that activity. So the evolution of blueberries and ribes and rubus, the currants, gooseberries, the blackcaps and the raspberries, all those kind of things started to evolve when more light was brought into the forest and when that organic matter was cycled and decayed into the ground, and that ash made the soil a little bit alkaline. Okay, so there's all this kind of evolution that happened, and we started to see a much more distinctive mosaic of forest. And part of the reason that European settlers didn't recognize that was because their concept of management was just almost the polar opposite of this, which I would call really agroforestry in the sense of mixing cultivation and stewardship of mainly forested land. When European settlers came, it was, again, the stark contrast, almost night and day. It was even actually law that if you wanted to claim ownership on land in the East, generally you had to clear it. You had to clear all the trees off, cut them down, burn the stumps, rip the stumps out, essentially make the land plowable. And by this time, Europeans had basically given all their attention to the plow, by and large, in terms of how they did agriculture. And this actually became, again, law. So it really shifted how the landscape was evolving. And this is something that we've inherited today. And out of a lot of the literature out there, this is a really great read, Changes in the Land by William Cronin, which chronicles and talks about some of the differences between native cultures that stewarded land for hundreds or thousands of years, and then how that shifted when European settlers came. And I think these perspectives are really important to dive into and pause and think about a little bit as we think about how we're gonna move forward. So I highly recommend that as a resource. What I've learned from teachers and mentors and what I think is really important to think about is, it's appropriate today because we're in a library, but to think of forests as really a living library. And so one of the challenges with this teenage forest is that we've essentially checked out all the good books a long time ago, all right? So some of the strongest, tallest, fastest, largest trees ever are gone, right? Those were the ones that were first harvested and turned into buildings and barns and railroads and whatever else, okay? So we've slowly removed sort of the best books in the collection, and that's one of our challenges. And we need to pay attention now to what genetics in the forest are adaptive and able to express some of the things we might need. But we have a limited collection to work with. And I think learning that story of a place over time is really key. And one of the key things I've learned is to really seek out individuals that have those stories and can tell those stories. Because personally, when I walk through the forest, you know, and especially as I was learning, I would see stumps and I would see this and that, but I didn't really know what was going on until I started walking around with people that could really tell me the nitty-gritty. And the photo here, this is Mike Daman. He's a local forester in the Finger Lakes area, and he has a really unique journey, I think, in that he's part Seneca Haudenosaunee, part Iroquois, and he was raised by a Seneca clan grandmother. He also went to forestry school in Montana and worked for the Forest Service and worked for large logging companies out west and worked for the Bureau of Land Management, and then came back to the Finger Lakes and for the last 20 years has been doing mostly private woodlot consulting. And so he's got this interesting mix. He's kind of seen the whole gamut of forestry, and I've gotten the opportunity to spend a lot of time with him in the woods, and the things I don't see, he can just point out in an instant and take me down this road and really teach me about this history. So here he is standing next to this stump, which again I saw as a cool stump, and generally I might look at that and see if I could find any mushrooms on it. Looks like it's pretty well rotten away. Maybe there's something I could eat there. But he proceeds to tell me about how old this stump is, about 300 years old. It's a white pine, and tracking ourselves back to that time and what pine meant. Excuse me, about 250 years old. White pine at that time, sort of colonial times, okay, was a really interesting and dynamic tree. And the interesting part is we think about the Revolutionary War and we think about tossing tea into the Boston Harbor, right? No taxation without representation. But white pines were actually forbidden to be cut. The British Crown would forbade colonists from cutting them, any white pine over 2 feet in diameter. And the reason for that was because the Crown was interested in those trees for building their navy. At that time, they were supercharging their navy, essentially, and needed pine mostly for ship masts and things like that. And so colonists, as an act of revolutionary defiance, would be cutting white pine and using it for all sorts of things. And actually, a lot of the American Navy was built out of these white pine, right, that were sort of secretly harvested. So here I am seeing a stump, right, and that's the story I get from someone who's read that landscape for a really long time. The picture up there is a stump of the American chestnut. And I lived on this piece of land and walked my dog by this stump every day. And until I went into that woods with Mike, didn't know it was American chestnut and didn't fully understand the story. If you haven't read and understood the whole story of the American chestnut, the immense intensity of this tree was really common in the eastern forest. In Virginia, it was 1 in 4 trees was an American chestnut, and these were really the redwoods of the east. I mean, just massive trees. And a fungal blight that was imported into New York City from Asia in the early 1900s was one of the fastest moving fungal blights ever and basically knocked out the chestnut. And it's really interesting to learn the story because the human responses was basically to cut them all down, cut our losses and leave. And in that, we lost a lot of potential to see what American chestnuts might have some resistance. And there's actually still about 1 million stump sprouts out there of American chestnut, of trees that have resistance. But it would have been interesting if we had those 100-year or 200-year-old trees doing that. And he's telling me this, and he's telling me this is probably a tree that was harvested around the time of the Civil War, right? So we get into this and what it was used for then, and then we wander a little bit back into the woods and we find some American chestnut sprouts, right? We get to see that actually happening in the woods. And so I think this perspective and trying to find these individuals and really capturing, just like we want to hold resources in the library for long-term use, these individuals that have this are really pretty remarkable and important to our communities. Anyone familiar with Tom Wessels? Who wrote a book called Reading the Forested Landscape. So he's up in New Hampshire, and he does forest walks. There's others around doing these kind of things, and I encourage you to keep your eyes out and if you're interested in this topic, to think about those. There's a lot of people that are out in the woods that have these kind of stories to tell. And one of the things I've really reflected on, again, prior to getting into some of the crops, this is a quote a teacher gave to me And it's actually attributed to a lot of different people. It's hard to know who originated it. But this idea that we don't see things as they are, but we see things as we are. And the question I ask myself is, what do I see when I look at the forest? Because if I just see, this place overgrown with invasive brush, which I've had students say, I'm going to have this kind of negative feeling about it. It's going to change my whole perspective and how I manage it. Or if I just see how many dollars can I get out of a timber harvest of this forest, that's one thing. But if I see like endless possibility in all these little niches and pockets that things can come in and interplay in, that starts to really shift the whole conversation, right? And so our perspective becomes really important. And as Ken and I wrote this book, we started to say, we have this interest in just, again, spending as much time in the woods as we can, and in pulling others to do that. And Ken's forest farming class was how I met him. How many years did you teach that? 6 or 8, yeah. and that was one of my favorite classes, because it was one of the only opportunities for students to be outside in the forest for a whole semester as part of their class, right? It was really unique in that way, and I think that connection is really, really pretty critical. And so we started to find forest farmers and craftspeople out there that really had this deeper connection to place and to the forest where they were from, which was really a nice discovery in writing the book, learning about the individuals. This is Daman Uticone. He has a company called Swamp Road Baskets, which is in Alpine, New York, just down the road from where we are, west of Ithaca. And Daman has carried on a tradition, which again started with Native Americans in the Adirondack region, and was transferred then to settlers as they came, where there's very few of these basket makers left who make baskets exclusively out of black ash, all right? So black ash is an interesting tree because it grows in swampy, wet areas. And if you take a tree down and you soak the log in water and then you pull it out and you pound the heck out of it with a mallet, the rings, each individual ring will actually pop off of the tree. And so he's popping off these individual rings, and then he takes them into his shop, and he's splitting those even further down into these fine, minute fibers, right? This is something that takes a lot of skill, and what you do when you're an apprentice is you beat those logs for 3 or 4 years before you get to make any baskets, right? That's the first step in learning this. And so he makes these absolutely gorgeous baskets. He was actually a couple years ago just featured on a Smithsonian tour of old world American craftspeople. And they came out, they had like flash bulb photography, and they did all these black and white images and kind of made it look real old. But this is someone who's doing this probably today as I speak, making these baskets, and moved to the area and bought his land because of the black ash that was there, right? Chose his place. And now his livelihood and his family's sustenance really relies on this craft. But those stories really also have this undertone of the context that we're in these modern times. This is something that's been going on for thousands of years, and these baskets will probably outlast Daman and probably outlast other people as well. They're incredibly indestructible. But with climate change, just a few years ago, emerald ash borer, the first sighting in New York State was in Schuyler County in Bath, New York, which is about 20 minutes from where Daman and myself live. And we haven't seen, luckily, the emerald ash borer spread far and wide, but that was a real alarm bell for someone who makes their living entirely off one species, right? And so they actually dug a pond in case they have to. Right now, they only harvest 1 or 2 trees a year, and that'll make hundreds and hundreds of baskets. But they built a pond in case they need to harvest more trees because they're being attacked by an emerald ash borer. So that's a real concern, and he's learning now to build baskets as well out of things like poplar and other materials, right? So times are changing, and we have to recognize that, again, not everything's going to look like it once did. It's going to be looking different as we move forward. So we have to be adaptive, and maple sugaring is another good example of that. We're seeing generally sugar maples having more and more trouble in the southern part of their range. Mostly that's regeneration, not so much the existing trees, but sugar maple seeds need 120 days of below freezing to stratify in order to break the seed coat so that they'll germinate. And so now in New York State where we are now, some winters we get that. This winter I can say with assurance we got there, all right, with our 120 days, but two winters ago we didn't at all, right? And so we're going to start to see this different pulsing of how sugar maples are germinating or not germinating. And we might see, there's predictions within 50 or 100 years, we might see maple sugaring starting around Christmas time, Okay, it used to start, it usually starts in February. This year was a little bit late, but February or March is usually when it starts. And in 100 or 200 years, it might not exist here. We might not have sugar maple trees. We might have all shifted sort of northward. And for me, this is maple sugaring was really my gateway into forest farming and agroforestry. And probably I could argue as far back as when I was 7 or 8 years old, when I was actually at a camp at the Cayuga Nature Center, which is up the west side of Cayuga Lake, and for the first time saw a spile going into the tree and the sap coming out. Got to drink the sap and was just blown. My 8-year-old mind was just blown at the idea that sugar was coming out of a tree, right? And that's really, I think, today still maintained is the best way to turn kids on to nature, is to show them where the sugar trees are, right, and let them taste that. And so that led me into a lot of education with that, looking at, again, is this something I want to do on a hobby scale or a commercial scale? This is at the 500 Tap Sugar Bush, which is in Enfield, still going today. And as we looked at the book and learned more about sap, what's interesting in North America is that we focus a lot on syrup. We love maple syrup, or most of us love maple syrup. But there's actually a much larger history, again, if we look at the larger context of not syrup, but sap, and consuming just straight sap out of the tree. And again, if we think hundreds or thousands of years ago, boiling lots of water, for maple it's 40 to 1, right? 40 gallons of sap make 1 gallon of syrup. That's a lot of water to boil. When technology was much more limited and fossil fuels weren't available, or wood wasn't easy to harvest with a chainsaw or something like that, I would argue that I would probably drink the sap too, right? It's a lot of effort. And so if we look worldwide, it's interesting that there's a much longer history of sap consumption, and it's not actually maple that is the most common, it's birch that's most commonly consumed. And so we see this really prevalent in Eastern Europe, in Russia, in Asia. And this is actually maple. This is in Korea, where they call the sap gorose, which means tree good for the bones, because maple sap is naturally high in calcium. Maple trees are a calcium accumulator in the soil. And so in Korea, you can go from the cities up into the hilltops, and you go to a farm, and you sit down basically in a room, kind of like a sauna, but not as hot, just a warm hut. You play cards with your family, you hang out, read magazines, and all day people bring you buckets of sap, and you pay anywhere between $5 and $10 a gallon. And you sweat out that winter funk, and you replace it with this vibrant tree sap, right? And there's an article in the New York Times talking about this, and it's interesting because only in the last couple of years have we seen sap starting to enter the U.S. and the North American market. There's 2 companies now that sell sap at stores, and I think we'll see more of this happening as we go. This is a naturally fortified, pure water source, and it's a really great way to connect to spring and a great thing to enjoy in terms of seeing how the waking up of the forest in the east. But a really important part of that is working on your sap face, which is the face you make when you're trying to catch that first drop of sap coming out of the tree, right? So of course we boil. We use a lot of wood when we boil. We have about 100 trees at our place now. And for me, sugaring time is the most awkward time of year for the forest. It seems like one day it's spring, one day it's summer, or winter, and it's kind of battling itself back and forth. It's when you get snow and rain and sleet and hail all in one day. The wind picks up, the wind dies down, the sun comes out, the clouds go back out, right? Those are the days we experience out there, but I get to see the forest waking up. You can actually feel that going on, and there's all these cool traditions around sugaring, like the sugar moon is the full moon during sugaring season. The first thunderstorm is really what a lot of natives around here in the Iroquois tradition saw as the beginning of spring, when you had that first thunderstorm. And when you're out boiling and hearing that thunderstorm for the first time, it's a pretty remarkable experience. But as we were sugaring, again, back to these teenage forests, I was learning about forestry, and it was interesting because I first tasted sap at the Nature Center, and then 15 years later ended up working there, teaching others about sap, which was pretty cool. And we had a lot of forests looking like this, where, again, young trees. And what's interesting about especially sugar maple ecology is that young trees will grow, lots of seedlings will sprout, and then they'll kind of thin themselves out over time. And about 20 years old, this is kind of what it looks like. We have lots of trees that are about 4 to 8 inches in diameter and pretty packed in, and it's a really good time to go in there and make some choices as a forester to select some, cut some out, and let those residual trees have a little more space. They're just going to do better in the long term. And so we were harvesting trees and had filled up the woodshed plenty high with firewood, and had filled up our neighbor's woodshed plenty high with firewood, and said, there's got to be something else we can do. Firewood feels like the last resort. There's so much wood, like there's got to be some higher value product we could think of. And that's what led us to mushroom cultivation. And this came from hearing first that there was a guy up the road who grew mushrooms on logs. It sounded really weird. We thought we'd have him out for a workshop, and we did. And we're taking spawn and plugging it into logs, and he says, well, we got to wait a year, right? Which seems like, oh, is this guy trying to scam me? Like I put sawdust in a log, and then I set it aside, and then maybe something will happen. But sure enough, a year later, the most beautiful mushrooms I'd seen popped out of this log, and I was pretty hooked. It was just one thing after the other. And that was before, this was Steve Serick, who, if folks may be familiar with, with his wife, owns Acorn Designs, which is like a tree-free paper company, card company, journal company. And he got into shiitakes before they were cool, we like to say, because they're pretty cool now. But 10 years ago, he was growing these on logs because he was interested in natural foods. And first through meeting Steve and then through meeting Ken, and Ken's been doing, for the last decade or so, research on log shiitake cultivation, which really has made my job easier, because now I can go out and tell farmers that they can actually make money growing these, because we didn't know that 10 years ago. We really didn't have any idea what you could grow them on, what it looked like, any of those things. And from there, we've branched out into lots of other things. So here's golden oysters on poplar, quaking aspen. Ken, in the last few years at Cornell, did a lot of work with lion's mane. This is hericium, which you can find in the woods, but we've had good luck growing it on sugar maple and American beech. Absolutely delicious mushroom, kind of tastes like lobster, like seafood, really, really wonderful. And really amazing research coming out about both its anti-tumor properties and also its ability to restore and repair nerve connections in the brain. And actually a lot of associations potentially with different illnesses to do with memory loss, Alzheimer's, that sort of thing. So people are starting to take this medicinally. In the last couple of years, we've been also working with this mushroom, winecap Stropharia, which unlike the other three grows in wood chips primarily, not so much on logs. But we found these to be, they're very portobello-like in taste, and they're really the gardener's best friend. Anywhere you've put wood chip mulch or straw mulch, you can inoculate with Stropharia, and it will inoculate itself around the entirety of your garden or your land. I mean, at this point at our farm, we don't remember where we planted it, and we're always excited to see where it shows up. So last year, we had patches of this in our garlic and our potatoes because they were nice and mulched, and we'd never inoculated them. We'd only inoculated 20, 30 feet away. So that's a fun one. If you're interested in mushrooms, we'll touch on this briefly, but we do have a website, cornellmushrooms.org, where we have some fact sheets on how to cultivate and some videos on how to cultivate. So the basic process of cultivating mushrooms is first harvesting some kind of substrate. We call substrate the food we give to the mushrooms. All four of those mushrooms are decomposers. Okay, we're not talking about growing morels or porcinis or chanterelles as much as I would like to. Those are all mushrooms that form a beneficial relationship with trees or plants. These mushrooms eat dead wood or dead woody material, and so it's much easier to grow them because you're just feeding them the right substrate. So we'll harvest that. We're just at the end of log harvesting season, right before the buds break out. I was out there this morning harvesting some logs for shiitake. Then we inoculate, which in the case of shiitake is drilling about 50 holes in a log and plugging it with the spawn, which is essentially the mycelium. That's the body of the mushroom. Okay, the mushroom itself is the fruit. The mycelium is this white thready material that's the body. And we'll inoculate that log. And then there is that waiting game, especially with logs. We do have to wait about a year. So that's step 3 there, the colonization. And then, of course, harvesting, eating, enjoying has to be step 4. Most of these logs, if they're this size, about 4 to 8 inches in diameter, if they're inoculated and after that first year, they will fruit for 2, 3, 4 seasons reliably after that. So it's a good investment. 1 year of work, and then you're just really harvesting. Maybe soaking as well. This is what a commercial operation looks like. What's interesting about shiitake, unlike those other species we talked about, is you can force them to fruit much more abundantly than they would naturally if you just let them hang out in the woods in the rain. In a good heavier downpour, you might get 2 or 3 of these mushrooms on a log, but if you soak them in a tank of water or in a pond or something for 24 hours, you get more like a quarter to a half pound of mushrooms per log. Okay, and so this is why I can go around now as a small farms extension person and say, hey, guess what? If you're interested, you have woods, this is a potential moneymaker for you if you're interested in that. Because you can reliably soak a certain number of logs in and guarantee a restaurant or a farmer's market you're going to have enough to sell. What's really cool also that we see is that mushrooms have this incredible potential also to be value added. And value added doesn't just mean preserving or making some interesting food product. It also means actually increasing the nutritional content. And so if you dry mushrooms in the sun, and the research that's been done has been with shiitake. Penn State has done some, and Paul Stamets as well, who's a big advocate for mushrooms. If you dry them for 5 hours in the sunlight, gills up is really important because those gills, the spores, are what give flavor and nutrition. So gills up, 5 hours in the sun, 200 or 300% increase in vitamin D in those mushrooms. That's pretty remarkable. So there's actually an enzymatic conversion going on in there where the sunlight is triggering and different things are being converted into vitamin D. If you're familiar with nutrition, vitamin D is this very deficient vitamin in our diet. It's very hard to find it in foods. So we can actually capture sunlight in our mushrooms and then store them for years on end, right? Pretty cool. And there's all these products now we see as the industry is starting to grow. All these interesting potentials, mushroom rub or over-dehydrating mushrooms, grinding them up. You can use that as a powder or even something to fry meat in. We have mushroom pate up there, which is usually mixed up with nuts and avocados and things like that as a dip or a spread for sandwiches. Lots of different dried and packaged mushroom products. And tinctures is something we're starting to see. The extracts that pull out some of the medicinal qualities of the mushrooms. And people are taking those on a regular basis. And so, again, just in the last few years, we've been able to actually put some numbers to this. We did a research project with 2, Cornell and University of Vermont and Chatham University. We worked with 25 growers. We had them actually keep records. That's a very hard thing to get farmers to do, is like keep track of their time and where they spent and all those kind of things. But luckily, we had a good chunk that did, and we were able to look at some numbers. So the costs, interestingly, is about $5 a log in costs, including labor costs. And we're seeing, again, $5 a year in profit, or in revenue coming out, I should say. Not profit, but gross revenue. $15 to $20 per log in their lifetime. So that's pretty good. $5 in, $15, $20 out. That's a pretty good conversion from an economic standpoint. And we saw most of our growers starting to make a profit in the second year and making around $4,000 or $5,000 by year 5, right? So mostly at this point we have small growers doing this on the side. Some of them have day jobs and they just soak their logs before they go to work, and then they pull them out when they get home or something like that. But certainly the potential is absolutely there. Before I got into commercially farming mushrooms, I did it in a backyard scale. I had 30 logs. 30 logs is a really good size if you want to grow your own mushrooms and just have about a pound a week. All right? So if you have 30 shiitake logs, we had 30 logs. We had a bathtub that we found in the woods. Someone had left there. We soaked our logs, 4 logs a week in the bathtub, and we were getting about a pound of mushrooms a week. Right? So it doesn't take a lot. You might spend $50 in a weekend to set yourself up with some nice homegrown shiitakes, right? So that's really cool, and I think mushrooms are one of Ken and my favorite things to talk about. You like to talk about ginseng as well quite a bit. But I think what's really exciting and what we found in writing the book was this idea of stacking different things on top of each other and really looking at a forest and saying, how many things can I pack in there, is really what's gotten me excited about thinking about some of this stuff. And we don't have to look, again, any further than forests around us for inspiration, because they're already pumping out lots of different food and medicine without anyone managing them, right? So this is a shot of the sugar bush at the Arnott Forest. So of course maple syrup and tree saps again are this amazing thing, because in generally we're almost wild foraging something that's already being produced. We're just harvesting and processing it. But what we see in this kind of ecology, and often sugar maples in this part of the world like to grow on north or northeast facing slopes, cool, wet, moist type slopes, is we start to see these other interesting characters show up. And again, back to the calcium that's in the leaves. So not only if we drink the calcium, not only if we drink the calcium is that good for our bones and good for us, but it's also good for the soil, right? So those leaves are accumulating calcium and then mulching the ground. And as it turns out, one of these high-value medicinal herbs, ginseng, American ginseng, which can be found wild. It is an endangered crop. One of the things we advocate for is that folks should be planting this just as a matter of conservation, if nothing else. But it's certainly a potent medicinal. This is by far the forest farming crop that would fetch the most per pound, up to $600 a pound, all right? Instead of waiting a year for mushrooms, you got to wait about 8 years, though, to harvest. These roots take a very long time. These rhizomes take a very long time to develop. But ginseng are heavy calcium feeders, so they actually benefit from being underneath that canopy of a sugar maple forest, and they like those wet, moist, north-facing soils as well. This is also the place where we often find something that's just starting to show up now, just starting to pop out. Really exciting, wild leeks or ramps, right? These are in the onion family. And actually on our blog, we just posted an article that's at farmingthewoods.com. The newest blog post is about ramp harvesting, because one of the things we're concerned about is the balance of how exciting and wonderful these are to harvest and enjoy, but the reality of some of the research that's gone on to how much you can harvest without degrading the population. And you'd be surprised, a lot of wild foraging says, oh, leave 2/3 and take 1/3, right? Not so with ramps. Research has found over a long-term study, multiple years, that 5 to 10%, harvesting more than 5 to 10% of a population can be detrimental to the population. And part of the reason, at least for that, is because a lot of these forest plants, ginseng and ramps, both have this characteristic. They have very long life cycles. Their seeds have double dormancy, so they need 2 years of cold temperatures in order to germinate. And so the plant is taking a really long time to develop. So if we go in there and scoop it all up in one season, we can really have an impact. So it's one thing we've been working on over the last few years, trying to do some propagation, which is challenging for ramps as well as for ginseng. But at least at first guess, we can promote low harvesting of a population, so less than 10%. And ideally, if you're harvesting, you're not digging out all the bulbs, you're just clipping the leaves. So you leave the bulb in the ground, and some of those bulbs will then be able to keep growing, okay? Other plants that show up on the edges, I've seen these a lot on where logging roads have entered forests, and you get these gaps, right? Old trails, old roads. Sumac, not to be confused with poison sumac, but which looks very different. The only thing is common really is the name. But staghorn sumac has these brilliant red berries, which at this time of the year is one of the foods birds are very excited to find, right? Because it's one of the remnants from past years. But this is actually one of the highest sources of vitamin C that we can find in the woods. And if you've never had sumac aid, in August you can harvest these rich clusters of berries when they're just right. You gotta get them. If you get them a little underripe, they're a little bitter. If you get them a little overripe, usually the bugs have moved in. So you have to find that window, which is usually a week, and you can soak this in water like a sun tea, and you get this amazing lemonade type beverage. And it goes perfect with a little bit of maple syrup, right? So there's our forest drink for the summer. And also along those logging roads, I often see elderberry, right? So all this stacking going on, all these plants taking not only niches in terms of space, but in time as well. So some of these being very early harvest, some of these being mid, and some of them being late season harvest as well. And so I found that very interesting when I came to the Nut Grove. Ken and I started to go to work to think about how we could incorporate some of the stacking that we saw naturally in the forest, some of this abundance. So here's Ken a few years ago giving a tour. This is an open house we did in the fall during our best nut production year on record. There were literally, the wind was blowing that day, and there were literally nuts just bombing down from the trees, and people were ducking and complaining. And I said, well, it's a nut open house. What do you expect? You're going to have nuts falling on you. This is a really unique site. It's just it's next to the Student Organic Farm. It's along Cascadilla Creek in the Plantations area. And we call this the Mcdaniels Nut Grove. Mcdaniels was a professor here for many years. Bit of a mysterious guy. We don't have a lot of photos of him. This is about the best we can come up with. This nut grove was essentially lost. We didn't have a lot of record. And Ken and some students were tipped off 2006, I want to say, around that time, to the potential of some kind of nut forest. Some old map sort of mentioned the nut woods or something off to the edge. And when they went through, this entire nut grove was full of honeysuckle, so you could barely see anything. I mean, it was just one big thicket. They started to notice these bulges. And if you look at the tree here closely, you have bark that looks like shagbark hickory on the top, and a whole different hickory there on the bottom that's pignut hickory. And that little bulge is because that graft isn't quite compatible. So there's a little bit of incompatibility, which led to the bulge in the tree. But good thing there wasn't full compatibility, because that was how we found this nut grove and realized that Mcdaniels had essentially planted at least 5 acres worth of these grafted nut trees. And what he would do is go to northern nut grower meetings, and the farmers would bring their biggest hickory nuts, and he would ask if he could get some of that seed. He'd bring it back to Cornell, he'd grow it out, and plant and do some grafting work. And what's really interesting about forest farming and some of these things is that a lot of this work is not only for now, but for that next generation, right? Because we're now benefiting from his work 90 years ago, right? I don't know if he even got to see the benefit of a lot of his work. So this is a variety in the nut grove, one of our best producers. This is my hand, all right? If you've ever wild harvested hickories, that's one big hickory nut. Here's a comparison. Once you take that husk off, because the husk always makes it look much bigger, you got to peel the husk off, and then you get to the nut shell itself. Here's a wild hickory, and here's the selected nut, right? Very interesting, and yet Mcdaniels was a bit of an anomaly, because there's not a lot of nut breeding that's gone on. We don't have as many cultivars, for sure, especially if we start to look at apples or other things out there. Just very little nut breeding going on. So a lot of folks, if they get into nuts, and hickory we like to call the king of nuts, because it's really one of the best tasting out there. If you go out wild harvesting, you're going to be finding mostly nuts like this. And while if we're going to plant nut trees on our land or think about nuts, we might think about selected cultivars. We've also learned about ways to process those smaller nuts. Because if you've ever harvested regular hickory nuts and went through the task of harvesting, you're like, I'm never going to do that again. That was fun for once, but by the time I bust through that husk and that shell, I get these little tiny pieces. I can barely even taste what it's like. But we need to harken back again to people that have lived here for a lot longer and have more experience, right? Because then we learn about hickory nut milk, which really makes a lot more sense. Because all you do is you basically smash up the nuts and you boil them. And the shells will float to the top, and all of the nuts will cook down into this amazing curd, kind of like almond milk almost. Really nutritious, and then you can either drink that or you can fully dehydrate it, and it's basically like a flour, right? So if you're wild harvesting and getting small nuts, this is one way you can process and enjoy that. And some of this food takes a little bit of culinary experience as well to enjoy in terms of our harvest. So we have this interesting nut forest as a backdrop. I want to show you one portion of it, the lower portion here, where again we've thought about not just, oh, it's really cool that Mcdaniels put these nut trees in, but like what else can we do in here? Let's really push this to the max, right? And so we've focused on this area as one area to work on. This is a lower part of the area, so the hickories are on the slope, kind of steeped area. This is down in the riverbank here, and black walnut is what Mcdaniels chose to plant down there, which is a great. Black walnut often likes those low riparian zones, and while black walnut's a wonderful tree in and of itself, and the nuts can be really wonderful as well, if you beat the squirrels to them, of course. There's one problem with the black walnut that makes it feel challenging to stack other plants in there. Does anyone know what that is? Juglans. So it has this toxicity that exudes from its roots. If you ever plant a vegetable garden underneath a black walnut in the town, your tomatoes will come up and look great, and then all of a sudden you'll come home one day and they look like they were zapped by something, right? And so this toxicity is incredibly potent, but yet we could see that as a disadvantage for some things, but we could also see it as an advantage because it's eliminating a lot of your weed pressure. if you could only find other interesting species to weave into this little walnut forest. And so we said, well, what else might work in this scenario? Since the squirrels were beating us to the nuts, we also thought, what else can we get out of the black walnut? And so for the past 2 seasons, we've actually tapped black walnut, which will run at the same time as sugar maple, and you can tap it for sap. And you can even make a syrup out of it. And it's about the exact same sugar content as sugar maple. All right? The amount of sap you get per tree is a little less than sugar maple, but we've successfully been making syrup for a couple of years now. And I will say the sap is good to terrible, depending on, we think what's going on is when you tap into the sapwood of the walnut, the sap comes out clear. But walnut has this very dark heartwood. And I think if you tap into that, your sap starts to get a little bitter. It's not as good. So maybe not as best as the maple for sap consumption, but certainly good for syrup.
I like it more than Steve.
Depends on the tree you drink it from. I tried this year about 10 different trees, and 5 of them tasted great, and 5 not so much. The syrup itself is very similar to maple in consistency, a little more of like a honey, like buckwheat honey kind of flavor to it. Very, very interesting, really nice. So we have this black walnut understory. The next thing that was put in, this was before my time, was Ken and some students planted Pawpaw, which is this very interesting native tree species. New York is about the northern range of the Pawpaw. Who here has had a Pawpaw? All right, not a bad percentage of the crowd. Sometimes there's only 1 or 2 people. The Pawpaw, even though it's a native fruit, relatively abundant, pretty easy to grow, never reached commercial fame, and we don't see it in grocery stores very often, although since you're on Cornell, you're in luck, because I go to other audiences and I say, well, good luck finding pawpaws. But here, Cornell has an orchard, and in the orchard store, usually in September into October, you can find pawpaws for sale. So pawpaw is this interesting fruit related to the custard apple, very tropical in origin, and probably been around for a very long time, maybe 1,000 years or more. And you can see the incredible diversity potentially of color, but also flavor. So this is at the Ohio Paw Paw Festival that I got to go to a couple Septembers ago. So everything from white, which has a very avocado type flavor, to kind of really bright orange, which is more of a mango flavor. And in between, you sometimes get these hints of vanilla and banana in there. I mean, really delicious stuff. Again, the range being pretty remarkable for pawpaw. And in its native habitat, it really likes to live in thickets in creek beds. And its propagation strategy is actually to send out root suckers. It doesn't actually flower and fruit that often in the wild. So if we want to cultivate it, we need to let in a little more light and maybe select some of those suckers out. When we do cultivate it, it can look like this. These are pawpaws that are over 1 pound in size, right? Quite remarkable. And one of the reasons that the commercial production hasn't really blossomed is because they're best harvested ripe off the tree, right? So if you harvest them too early, they'll never fully ripen. They'll just stay hard as a brick. In some cases, you can harvest them a little underripe and keep them for up to 4 to 6 weeks in the fridge. But the best enjoyment is really letting them start to actually brown up on the tree and get really soft. And then you pick it, cut it, and usually eat it just with a spoon right out of the husk. Quite delicious. What we see of growers is that they're either, if they're doing this commercially, is they're selling as much as they can fresh, and then they're also doing a lot of frozen pulp. And with a regular home food processor, it's pretty easy actually to separate the seeds from the pulp. And there's really nothing better than a pawpaw smoothie, about January when you're living in upstate New York, I guarantee. So we've been hoarding lots of pawpaws from Cornell. I might beat you to the sale and get those pawpaws home before anyone else. But this Paw Paw Festival is actually started because a grower was trying to find ways to sell this fruit, and no one had ever heard of it, and they thought it was really weird. All right, and that was, let's see, this is the 11th annual. I think it's the 13th annual. That was 13 years ago. This festival is now 10,000 people who come demanding pawpaws and buy every pawpaw that's on the fairgrounds, right, when this is happening. And of course, this is the only place you can meet a real life-size pawpaw. You could drink a pawpaw beer, and you could participate in a pawpaw eating contest. No hands allowed, of course. I think he might be winning. This guy doesn't look too happy. A couple years ago, a senator from Ohio came and declared pawpaw the state fruit. And that southern edge of Ohio into Kentucky is actually kind of the heartland, kind of one of the best pawpaw growing regions anywhere. So these pawpaws have been persisting really well in our, you can see a few here in the Nut Grove, for about 10 years, doing great with the juggalo. They also like that wet, moist soil down in the riverbed. So the next crop then is, we have a understory tree, which is really nice. The next crop that we found to be potential in this little mixed polyculture here is elderberry. And elderberry is really wonderful in that it's probably one of the easier plants to propagate. If you're familiar with willow stakes, before willows bud out, you can cut a stake out of the tree with a couple buds on them, and basically pound it in the ground with a mallet and you have a tree. Right? And I wish every plant was that easy to propagate, but if you've ever tried, you know there's very few that'll be that willing, but elderberry being an exception. These are literally cuttings that we took in March and stuck in the ground, and they rooted and started to grow. Right? So you can see, pretty easy to propagate and to grow. These are wonderful, very adaptive species that like edges. They like a little bit of sun, a little bit of moisture, but they can grow pretty well in pretty full shade as well. And what we've been finding is the best way to process them is, this is not a berry that you eat raw. This is actually one that you harvest fresh, and then you need to cook in some capacity. And actually, if you eat them raw, they can be mildly toxic if you eat too many of them. So this isn't a fruit you actually want to eat raw. But if you freeze the berries for about 24 hours, then it's very easy to pull them off the stems. You can actually harvest the whole cluster with pruners, freeze the berries, and then rake them off with a fork. And what we've been doing at our farm is using a steam juicer, very simple piece of technology where the fruit goes in the top, water goes in the bottom, steam rises, pulls the juice out, and it settles in this middle compartment, and then we're able to can it from there. And this is one of these interesting crops where it's incredibly medicinal. There's actually really good research out there about it, elderberry syrup being comparable to a lot of flu medications, cold and flu medications, in terms of fighting those symptoms. And this was generally a very common thing to see in the American household cabinet. Everyone would make some elderberry syrup, and you can leave it plain as just the elderberry. You can mix a little honey in there. And frankly, at home, it makes me want to get sick, it feels like, because I'm not allowed to eat the elderberry unless I'm sick, because we have a limited supply. But it's quite delicious. And it also sells for a pretty high price, $2 to $5 an ounce. This is something that in Europe is common knowledge. This is what people go for when they have colds and flus. And it's something that's growing in our ditches and our creeks around here, right? And it's also juggalo intolerant, all right? There's another one, too, that is often showing up in forests that people say, well, why would you ever want to grow aronia? It's got a good common name. It's called chokeberry. If you've ever eaten the berries raw, you'll know why it's called chokeberry, because it makes you want to choke. But again, if you harvest these berries and make them into a juice, incredibly potent medicinal plant, very easy to grow. And Europe, again, this is a very common thing to see in the medicine cabinets of people in Europe. So we have this layered system working our way down, black walnut to pawpaw to elderberry. Got to put some mushrooms in here. So here's what the Stropharia look like in the Nut Grove. Again, this is almost as easy. I can pretty much tell you how to inoculate right now. You clear away some soil to bare ground, you put the spawn down, you put some wood chips on top. That's about it, all right? And the Stropharia will move its way through the wood chips and then fruit anywhere from 1 to 6 times in a season. It's a whole surprise. I can't tell you when, why, or how, but they just will show up. They're quite wonderful. Really fun to see showing up. And then our last, as we get down towards the creek, we started to establish willow here as a plant that can be harvested for other material and also hold that stream bank. Willow have incredibly fibrous root systems that'll hold your waterways in place. And Ken and I got to see a really amazing example of this in Canada when we went to an agroforestry conference a couple summers ago. This is a willow buffer between a potato field up here, and this is the Prince Edward Island Sound on the other side of this. And there's a big fishing industry in Prince Edward Island, lots of mussels, things like that. So there's a lot of concern about the runoff. Potatoes are this huge crop on this island, which I had no idea. It's basically the Idaho of potatoes in Canada. And these willows are capturing that fertilizer. These are only 2 years old. They're just growing nutso because they're harvesting all that extra fertilizer runoff. And then the farm was actually harvesting these, chipping them, and then running them through a gasifier to make their own electricity, right? So no pollution going in, harvesting and using that as an energy source, right? And there's, of course, a really successful willow project at Cornell that's been working with this as a biomass product as well. So that's a lot of species packed into one space, right? And that's really what we're after here. I'll just end with talking. Mary mentioned the ducks and slugs. So I have to leave you with this image burned in your brain, which is slugs mating. So here you go. You've always wondered. We've learned a lot about slugs at our farm over the past few years, unfortunately, because when you grow mushrooms, you also raise slugs, it seems like. So that's the downside, is you essentially create something that produces millions and billions of these really aromatic spores that attract slugs. All right. So again, back to some of my original training, which during college I took this permaculture course. One of the things that stuck in my head for years and years was one of the co-founders was known to say, Bill Mollison was known to say, you don't have a slug problem, you have a duck deficiency. Okay. And what he was getting at there is that if there's a pest problem or a disease problem in your ecosystem, it might be a symptom of something missing, right? A character that's missing. Because if we look at ecology, populations balance themselves out by finding those other players to come in and intervene, right? So for 3 years, we've been working with this idea of, can we get our ducks in the woods and rotate them in such a way that they'll actually reduce our slug population? And so at first, we put the ducks in with the logs, and we realized there were two problems there. One was that ducks will eat mushrooms, so that doesn't work so well if our goal is to produce this crop. And the second thing was that we realized from like a food safety perspective, usually, and it's under organic standards not allowed, you can't have animals and manure close to your food crop, right? And so it looked problematic, but we eventually found out a solution that's worked well. We have these little red boxes here where we keep our logs, our fruiting logs, and they have a little wire fence, like a chicken wire fence around them to keep the ducks out. And then this is our portable electronet fencing that we move the ducks around in. So we basically have what we call the duck moat, all right, around the logs. So slugs are trying to get in, and the duck moat will keep them from entering the logs, right? So we realized that it actually wasn't important for the ducks to literally try to eat slugs off the logs. That was way too late. What we wanted to do is reduce the overall population. And so after 3 years of doing this, we rotate our ducks in here 3 times a year, and then we head them out to pasture so they can get a little bit of salad in their diet. They like a little bit of meat, a little bit of salad. And we last year had 0 slug damage. We found 2 slugs all season, right, from that. Not to mention that the ducks also were producing eggs at the same time and having a blast. That's their favorite thing to do. If you asked a duck what it wanted to do every day, all day, it would say hunt for slugs in the soil. And so at our place, we've stacked this. We have 1 acre of sugar maple. We do our syruping. We have our ducks. We have our mushrooms. And we've actually started some ginseng, although, again, I'm counting on that more for retirement than for a crop for next year. So that's what I got for you. I'll take a few questions if there's a few minutes so we can remain. Thanks for your attention. Appreciate it.
This has been a production of Cornell University Library.